India is now the fifth largest economy. But here is the big question. Does that mean that we'll keep growing? Whether India rises or stays stuck depends on whether we can see through these 5 myths. These myths sound good, they feel comforting, but in reality, they're holding us back. And the last one might decide our entire future. Stick around, because once you see these 5 myths clearly, you will never look at the Indian economy the same way again. Hello, if you're new here, I'm Ronak, the economist on a mission to make economic ideas simple and relatable. In this video, we'll explore 5 big ideas that people often believe about the Indian economy. For each one, we'll ask 3 simple questions. Where does this belief come from? How true is it? And why does it matter for India's future? And by the end, we'll have a sharper picture of where India really stands and answer the big question we started with. Is India truly on its way to becoming rich? The first myth we often come across is that India is a huge consumer market. So where does this belief come from? When people say that India is a massive market, they usually point to our population. 1.4 billion people. Politicians highlight it, global companies mention it, and even in everyday conversations, we often assume big population means big market. The reality is more nuanced. India, while the 5th largest economy in total size, but on a per capita basis, is still very small. Our average income is around $2,700 a year. Compare that to China's $13,000 or US's $80,000, we suddenly realize that for many global companies, India looks smaller than it seems. For example, India accounts for around 3% of Apple's global revenue. It is likely that Apple sells more iPhones in California than it does in the entire India. Believing that India is already a huge market creates a policy blind spot. It reduces urgency to invest in productivity and global competitiveness. And it also feeds into our second big mistake, the idea that exports don't matter. If we think our domestic market is enough, we are more likely to overlook the role of global trade. So let's take that up next. The second myth, that exports don't matter. So where does this belief come from? The belief often comes straight out of the first myth. If we already think that India is a huge consumer market, then why bother selling to the world? The idea of self-sufficiency and interpreting India's billion-plus people as ready-made market leads us to overly rely on domestic demand. That does not exist and leads to a thought process that exports are optional. Every economy that made the leap from poor to rich in a relatively short period of time, for instance Japan and Korea in the 20th century and China in the 21st century, did so on the back of exports. Domestic consumption played a role, but it was global markets that provided scale. Today, India's exports of goods and services are about 22% of GDP, far lower than the East Asian tigers like Korea, China and Taiwan, whose exports made a close to 40% of GDP during their high growth years. In other words, India has not yet integrated into global trade. But why does this matter? Believing that exports don't matter risks slowing down reforms that would make India globally competitive. And without exports, India's domestic market will eventually hit a ceiling. To keep growing incomes and creating jobs, we need to sell to the world. Which brings us to our next myth, the idea that agriculture is the backbone of the Indian economy. So where does this belief come from? Intuitively, it feels true. So many people work in farming, and villages have always been seen as the heart of our country. This is because we all grew up hearing about it in school textbooks, political speeches, and even in Independence Day addresses. Add to that the fact that nearly 40% of our workforce is engaged in agriculture, it is easy to believe that agriculture is the backbone of the Indian economy. But in reality, agriculture is one of the least productive parts of the Indian economy. While nearly 40% of our workforce is still in farming, it contributes less than 18% to our GDP. That means the average worker in agriculture adds far less value than someone in manufacturing or services, which reflects in their incomes. So why are so many people still on farms? Not because agriculture is thriving, but because there aren't enough opportunities elsewhere. And those opportunities haven't been created, partially because we have been thinking under the influence of myth 1 and myth 2, that India is a huge market and exports don't matter. So why does this matter for India's future? Treating agriculture as the backbone of the Indian economy risks keeping millions of people trapped in low productivity work. If we see farming as the foundation of our economy, we underinvest in creating high-value jobs that can raise incomes. In fact, the most assured way to double farmer income is not subsidies or support prices, it's having fewer farmers. When some people move into more productive work in industry, in services, the ones who remain in agriculture can cultivate larger plots, use better technology, and earn more. The real challenge for India today is to enable a massive transition away from agriculture into factories, offices, and new industries. That is how we lift productivity, raise incomes, and support the kind of export growth that India needs. And this connects directly to the next myth. Many people believe that our biggest problem is our population. But is that really the case? We all know that one person who always says, if only India had fewer people, everything would be better. And at first, it feels tempting. Crowded trains, overflowing cities, and long queues. It feels like the root cause of every problem is simply too many people. But where does this belief come from? This belief has deep roots in Indian history. In the 1970s, the government pushed aggressively on family planning, and the controversial sterilization drives led to this belief. These policies reinforced the idea that population itself was the core problem holding India back. Underneath this belief lies a zero-sum mindset, the idea that the economy is a fixed pie, and more people just mean thinner slices. But evidence shows us that economies don't work this way. So here's the reality. India's population is not the problem. Jobs are. India now has the largest working age population in the world, and this is an enormous advantage. Our issue is not that we have too many people, but there are too few productive opportunities. If we look at China, we can see how they leveraged population to become a manufacturing powerhouse, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. In contrast, countries in parts of Africa and Latin America also have large populations that are stuck without jobs, leading to stagnation and unrest. We can see that India now stands at this crossroad. So why does this matter? If we keep believing that population itself is the problem, we risk treating people as a burden rather than an asset. But people are not the problem, wasted potential is. The real task is to create jobs that make our young workforce productive. Done right, this demographic wave could be India's greatest dividend. Done wrong, it could become a liability. And that takes us to our final and perhaps the most dangerous myth, the idea that India is bound to get rich, no matter what. It feels almost natural to believe this. We are a young country, one of the world's largest economies, growing faster than most other countries. So how could we not eventually end up rich? This belief comes from looking at the momentum of the past few decades. India has risen in the global rankings, lifted millions out of poverty, and built a confident middle class. Add to that our size and demographics, and it feels like success is inevitable. Politicians, business leaders, and even the media narratives often reinforce this destiny story. But history shows us economic growth is never automatic. Many countries were once seen as rising stars, but never made it. Argentina was as rich as Europe in early 20th century, but slid into crisis after crisis. Brazil and Philippines had long growth spurts and then stagnated. Several African economies with abundant resources have never escaped the poverty trap. For India, our demographic and our size give us potential, but potential is not destiny. Without sustained reforms, investment, and productivity gains, growth can stall, just like it did for all those countries. This myth is dangerous because it breeds complacency. If we assume that prosperity is guaranteed, we won't do the hard work needed to achieve it. India's rise is not destiny, it's a choice. Getting rich will require consistent reforms, better jobs, stronger exports, and higher productivity. If we put in the work, the opportunity is enormous. But if we don't, we risk being yet another country that started strong but never crossed the finish line. And that brings us back to the big question we started with. Will India get rich? The answer depends on whether we can see through these 5 myths and focus on the real levers of growth. As we shape the next century of India's progress, let's remember, no one gets rich by default. Nations, like people, only get rich by design and through choices that we make. Hi, if you're new here, I'm Ronak, an economist on the mission to make economic ideas simple and relatable. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do let me know what you thought about it in the comments. And if you're curious about the Indian economy, the global markets, or just want to see everyday life through a sharper lens, please do subscribe. I will see you in the next video.